Happy? Here we go. Our state is in the grip of a youth crime epidemic, and Queenslanders are demanding action immediately, and so they should. Reports today of a repeat hardcore youth offender going about his business with absolutely no consequences for action shows how dire things have become. The state government consistently says that repeat offenders aren't being denied. The state government consistently says that repeat offenders aren't out on our streets. Well, how much more repeat can you get than 80 charges without a conviction and over a dozen evade police? This is beyond a joke. And Queenslanders are living through it. And they're living through the consequences of a watered down Youth Justice Act, and they're living through the consequences of no consequences for action. And so again, today, we appeal to the government to do two things. One is recall Parliament immediately. Let's get cracking. Let's get back from leave and let's make the changes that are needed to protect our community. And the second, let's change the Youth Justice Act to make sure that consequences for actions matter. Let's make breach of bail an offence. Let's make sure that the rights of the victim come before the rights of the alleged offender. I've asked Laura, who's our Shadow Assistant Minister for Justice, to join me today. And Laura, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Sam. This 15-year-old offender is a product of the Palaszczuk Labor government's watered-down Youth Justice Act. At the time that the Palaszczuk Labor government chose to water down the Act back in 2015, this offender would have been 7 years old. 7 years, fast forward 7 years down the track, and we have a hardcore repeat offender who is terrorising a community, and the Palaszczuk Labor government has let it happen. They watered down the Act so that detention was a last resort, and they've continued to incrementally water down the Youth Justice Act, and this offender is the result of that. Parliament must be recalled so that we can fix the Youth Justice Act. Reforms are needed, and that is only going to happen if the law is changed. Breach of bail must be an offence. Consequences for action must be embedded in the Youth Justice Act so that we can curb these youth criminals. This 15-year-old child, aside from being able to terrorise a community, has not had the benefit of rehabilitation. He's not been removed from community so that he can then be put into some rehabilitative programs to get him back on the right path. Now, that is a result of a watered-down Youth Justice Act where detention is a last resort, and it cannot continue. We need Parliament to be recalled so that we can fix the Youth Justice Act, so that we can ensure our community is protected, and so we can ensure that the rights of the victim come first.
Thanks, Laura. Over to you guys.
What was your initial reaction when you saw that?
I was gobsmacked. How can it be that an act can be so weak that someone can have 80 offences and never feel the consequences of that? How you can actually feel the desperation in police, knowing that this young repeat criminal will be out doing the same thing again, time and time again. No consequences for action. And it completely blows a hole in the government's argument that the worst of the worst are behind bars. They're not. And they're not because of the way the Act is written. And the government can blame everyone they like and they can point fingers left, right. But in the end, they are responsible for the Act. And you know that because when we had the tragedy on Boxing Day of the Lovels, and that is a tragedy, the government had yet another insert number of point plan here. But we've been down this path before. And until you fundamentally change the Youth Justice Act and make consequences for actions matter, you're going to continue to see it. And we are living through a generation of repeat hardcore young offenders who know that their rights outweigh the rights of the victim. And that's not the modern Queensland that we deserve.
Is it watered down laws, or is it magistrates perhaps, or people in the system not doing their job?
No, we won't cop that. In the end, governments set laws. And I'm going to ask someone who knows a thing or two about it to make some comments on that. But I'll make the point. The government has sought to blame everyone else but themselves. But in the end, it's the job of this building to make change and provide a Youth Justice Act to ensure that people are held accountable for what they do. And the fact that the government has had another knee-jerk reaction to say that they will change the laws because things aren't working shows that. The issue is that they're not getting to the heart of the issue, and that is truly making sure there are consequences for action. And the fact that they're not willing to debate it for nearly another month and a half just shows a real lack of understanding of how much this means to the community. Do you want to make some comments about the law?
Sorry, do you want the Parliament to be recalled to implement those laws that they've flagged?
Great question, Garth, and the answer is simple, and that is we will work constructively to look at any changes that can improve the system. And I just hope the government does the same, because we've been really consistent talking about breach of bail as an offence and having consequences for actions embedded in that act. And I would love the government to show the same level of maturity that we have. Now, when the tragedy happened in Australia Day 2 years ago, there was another point plan that was rolled out. And at the time, we looked at it, and the signature policy, you will recall, were GPS trackers for offenders. Now, we looked at that legislation and we said the way it was worded, we didn't believe that it would have the effect. Fast forward 18 months and less than 10 people have been fitted with one of those. And the number one reason why they're not fitted is because they don't want to wear one. Now, despite that, in a mature fashion, we said, well, we're not going to stand in the way of what the government believes could be a constructive change. And nor will we this time. Of course, we'll look at things open-minded and we'll put forward our changes where we would do things better and what we see as the flaws and what we see as the strengths. We would like the same level of maturity. But one thing is certain. Not doing anything for nearly 6 weeks isn't an option, and not having consequences for action and ensuring that people can be held accountable for their bail conditions is just an absolute abrogation of responsibility. And we want the government to acknowledge that they have created a generation of repeat hardcore young offenders, and nothing short of a wholesale change to the Youth Justice Act will cut it. You want to make a comment? Yeah. We're in the middle of a youth crime epidemic right now, and my fear is that while the government stays on holidays, we could have another tragedy, and we're certainly going to have the crime epidemic that's occurring. I'll give an example. In the first half of the month of January in Cairns alone, there were 33 cars stolen. Now many of those will be repeat offenders. But it's not just in Cairns, it's in Townsville, where it's been on repeat for over 7 years, west to the Isa. The reports coming out of Gundawindi of one offender alone burning a couple of dozen cars, north side, south side of Brisbane, both of the coasts, Mackay, Toowoomba, a once beautiful city where you barely heard of crime. It's being ripped apart at the moment. So I don't believe we can wait for 6 weeks. We get paid to do a job. And that job is to pass laws to keep the community safe. And I don't accept that in the middle of a youth crime epidemic, Queenslanders should have to wait until the end of February. Did you want to make some comments about some of those laws?
Yeah. Look, as a former prosecutor, as a former Commonwealth prosecutor, I have appeared in call-overs where there's been a Commonwealth bench charge sheet and breach of bail has been an offence on those. And I know that it's the law that the magistrates and judges apply in relation to dealing with that offence. The Palaszczuk Labor government removed breach of bail as an offence for juveniles back in 2015. Now, the magistrates and the courts are simply applying the laws and the direction that the Palaszczuk Labor government has given them as part of the Youth Justice Bench Book to the cases they're applying. Now, it is my position, and this comes from being a former prosecutor and a Commonwealth prosecutor, I think judges should be given the freedom to be able to determine what penalties suit the offence at the time of a hearing. And I think the Palaszczuk Labor government, by watering down the Youth Justice Act, by dictating to judges that detention is the last resort, by removing breach of bail as an offence, has taken that power away. They've hamstrung our police by not giving them enough resources. We know that right now, today, there are 12 less police on the beat than there was in 2020. 12 less police. They've removed safe night precincts, which means that our police are now having to babysit drunks in Surfers Paradise and in the Valley, as opposed to being out there and doing what they want to do, which is protecting our community. So I think that it has to fall back to the lawmakers. The Palaszczuk Labor government is the lawmaker. They have watered down the laws. The accountability has to sit with them.
So, yeah, because they've consistently maintained they've got this presumption against bail, those laws, and looking at these 80 offences, it looks like the police are doing their job. But, are those laws not tough enough? Is that what you're saying? They're not tough enough?
Clearly they're not working. Clearly they're not working. This 15-year-old offender has committed 80 separate offences and still in our community. Now, I'm sorry he hasn't been given the rehabilitation he needs. The judges and the police don't have the power to remove him in order to make sure not only the community is safe, but that he is rehabilitated. That is a failure of the system, any way you dice it. So the Youth Justice Act mandates that judges and magistrates have to record no conviction for certain offences. It's embedded into the Youth Justice Act. It is a lawmaker decision. It is a direction the Palaszczuk Labor government has given our magistrates, and so it falls back onto lawmakers to correct that or to amend the Youth Justice Act in a holistic way so that we address this youth crime epidemic. Because this 15-year-old is a product of the Palaszczuk Labor government's Youth Justice Act. He was 7 years old at the time of the watered down laws. He's 15 now, and he's a recidivist offender, and he's received zero rehabilitation, and he's still in our community. Look, I think once Parliament is recalled, we will be expecting the Palaszczuk Labor government to listen to Queenslanders who are calling for breach of bail to be an offence. It's absolutely ludicrous that it's not. And then we will start to see an impact. I mean, we will start to see that once you have consequences for action, that will affect the criminals. The youth, they know that they are not. This kid is a perfect example of it. He is absolutely thumbing his nose at police and the law. He's intentionally, recklessly driving and evading police because he knows that police don't have the power to detain him, to remove him. My biggest fear, back to your question about what difference this will make if Parliament is recalled, my biggest fear is that this 15-year-old will become the next person that ends up tearing apart another Queensland family in road trauma as a result of his actions. Now, the Palaszczuk Labor government need to change the law in order to prevent that, and recalling Parliament is the way to do it.
With all these young offenders that are committing multiple offences, if breach of bail is a law, we're going to have a situation where our youth detention centres just going to be overcrowded with all these young.
Look, I don't think so. I think that allowing judges and magistrates the ability to look at a case and decide what punishment fits the crime is what our community expects. But at the moment, they are hamstrung with weak laws. They don't have that power. Breach of bail is not an offence. Detention is a last resort. The Youth Justice Act says no conviction must be recorded. All those things take power away in relation to considering all the circumstances of a case when a young offender comes before the court.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Have a good day,
Thanks.
guys.